I think we're still waiting for a few people, so we might want to give it a minute or two and then get started. Does that sound okay to you, Aaron?
It does. And we'll do quick introductions again today, but we'll try to keep it quick. So we're not going to, get bogged down in that, but we'll spend a few minutes on introductions.
Do you want to combine that with the roll call then, so that we don't have to go through the list twice?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, how about that? How about what we'll do is you'll do the roll call, and when you call in, they'll just say who they are, where they're from.
Yep, that sounds great to me.
Perfect. Thank you. And for all the participants, I'll say this when I go over kind of the ground rules. It would be helpful to the extent you can that you have your cameras on. It's just easier to read the room that way. But I am also not a tyrant and understand that life is hard in Zoom. So, if you can't do it, you can't do it. But to the extent you can, it is helpful.
All right, why don't we get started since we have limited time today?
Yep.
So we'll start the meeting by doing a quick roll call where I'll read off names, and it's to make sure that everyone's sound and microphones are working. So if you can unmute and say here when I call your name, I'd appreciate it. And Aaron would also like for everyone who's participating to provide a short introduction of themselves, who they are, where you're from, that sort of thing. Okay, so.
Emphasis on short.
Yeah, Aaron, why don't we start with you?
Sure, Aaron Nielsen. I am a professor at BYU and I chair the committee.
David J. Apple. Warren Belmar. Jody Bernstein. Marshall J. Breger. Amy Bunk.
Hi, this is Lane Murray. Amy Bunk, my colleague, will be calling in later. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. John Cooney.
Here, I'm 5 years at OMB getting the regulatory review program off the ground and 45 years litigating administrative law cases.
Bridget Dooling.
Hello, Bridget Dooling. I'm a senior fellow with ACUS and a research professor at the GW Regulatory Studies Center.
Tobias Dorsey. I think he may be joining us late. Fred Fielding. David C. Frederick. Bill Funk.
I am here. I'm the liaison from the Administrative Law section of the ABA and Professor Emeritus at Lewis and Clark Law School.
Robert Gerard.
Here, as senior counsel at OPM.
Claire Green.
Hi, this is Claire. I'm the staff director at the Social Security Advisory Board. And I apologize, every time I try to put on my video, I get this searching for network and kind of lose. So I'm not going to be on screen today, but maybe next time.
Sounds good. Allison Ho. I think she may also be late. John Kamensky.
Here, senior fellow ACUS.
Mohammed Mesbahi, who's serving as alternate for Eric Lepresti.
Hi, I'm here, Mohammed Mesbahi from the Taxpayer Advocate Service, representing Senior Advisor to the National Taxpayer Advocate, Eric Lepresti, and the National Taxpayer Advocate herself. We are the independent internal oversight of the IRS.
Great. Jennifer No. And
Here,
Joseph, oh, you're here, great.
Here, Sarah, University of Chicago.
And Joseph O'Connell.
Here, I'm a senior fellow at ACUS and a professor at Stanford Law School.
Nina Olson. Jesse Panuccio. Oh, he said no. Elizabeth Papez. Eloise Pasakoff. Lauren A. Smith. Max Steer. And Jim Tozy.
Here, if you could.
Yes, we can hear
me.
you now.
Okay.
And I see, did I see David A. Paul join?
Yes, I did.
Okay, I thought that was David's iPad. And then, so that was the members of the Committee of Administration and Management who all have speaking privileges and voting privileges. My next list are individuals who are not committee members, but are still members of ACUS or their alternates. Robert Stone.
Hi, I'm here, Robert Stone. I'm an economist at OSHA. I've been doing public policy rulemaking work in the Department of Labor for over 20 years. Thank you.
Stephanie Tatham.
Hi, this is Stephanie. I'm here. I hope to join you on video soon. I'm just waiting for tech support.
Awesome. Carrie Ricci. Deborah Aiken, who is attending on as an alternate for Jonathan Doles.
Deborah Aiken here, Department of Transportation.
Radha Vishnuvajala, who is serving as an alternate for Peter Constantine.
Hi, I'm here. I'm a senior attorney for administrative law at the Department of Labor, and Peter Constantine is the associate solicitor for legal counsel at the Department of Labor.
Helen Serasio, who's serving as an alternate for Carol Ann Siciliano.
I'm Helen Serasio, and I am the Associate General Counsel for Cross-Cutting Issues Law Office.
And then David Rostger, who is serving as an alternate for Charlie Maresca.
Dave Rosger, Assistant Chief Counsel, representing Charlie Maresca, Director of Interagency Affairs, Office of Advocacy and Liaison to ACUS.
Okay. And is there anyone who is on the call who is a member of the committee or a member of ACUS who is not on the committee or one of their alternates? Jonathan, yeah, okay, sorry. I should have called our two consultants who are also on the call. Jonathan Weiner.
Yes, hi, I'm Jonathan Weiner, Duke University. I'm a public member of ACUS, but here serving as the consultant on this project.
And Lori Benier.
Hi, Lori Benier, Professor of Energy Economics and Policy at Duke University, one of the consultants. Thanks.
Great. If there are no other ACUS members or their alternates who are present, I think I'll hand it over to Matt Weiner.
Can I jump in?
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Sorry, I arrived late. This is Toby Dorsey. I'm a liaison member from the Office of Administration, Executive Office of the President, where I am the managing counsel for legal policy.
Great, I'm glad you could make it. Okay, now I think I turn it over to Matt Weiner.
Aaron, I don't want to stand between you and a on time or even early adjournment today, so I'll turn it back. I'll turn things back over to you with all of our thanks for everyone for joining us on a Friday afternoon to address this important issue. Thank you, Aaron.
Perfect. Thank you, Matt. All right, so I'm going to do a quick recap of the ground rules. This is what we went through last time. Please note that only ACUS members and their designated alternates have full speaking privileges. To avoid background noise, please keep your microphone on mute and either use the Zoom's hand raise feature or add a comment in the chat feature. That's especially important because once we have the screen up, it's hard for me to see all of you. So I prefer the comment feature, just say comment and then I can call on you. If you can, use your webcam. I understand that's not possible. And if you can't, don't worry about it. But to the extent that you can, please do. With requests to participants other than ACUS members and alternates, it requires the unanimous consent of the committee members. Time permitting, I'll consider calling on such participants as appropriate. And we will presume that committee members consent absent an objection. Again, use the comment function. If we get a vote today, which I doubt, then we'll go through the procedures on that. But I hope we get a good chunk of the recommendations through so we can do a vote on our next meeting from 2 weeks from now. So with that, Leanne, can you please bring up the show?
Yep. There we go.
Well, and while we're doing that, I just want to say thanks. I saw we had some pre-submitted comments, including some edits by Bill Funk, which I think were really helpful. So thank you for that. So what I'm inclined to do is we didn't quite make it all the way through the first section last time. Since then, we've had some changes sent, including the language from Bill. I'm inclined to knock out the first section first and then get on to the new stuff. So maybe let's start again. What's the first one that we have new commentary on? Is that recommendation 1?
Yeah, so I put in this comment for the benefit of the committee because I had been asked to check how previous recommendations on periodic review or retrospective review had done the scope of what regulations fell within its parameters. And it turns out that our previous recommendations only used the language existing regulations. It didn't further define it beyond that. So the committee may want to go more in depth, or they may be satisfied with existing regulations. I'm not sure.
Okay, well, with that, I'll throw it up for comments. Again, I'll put my cards on the table. I'm inclined not to go beyond legislative rules. I think that we're already doing a pretty big project here. If we start getting into other things that are technically rules or regulations, but aren't legislative rules, that we're just opening up a bigger project than I think we need. I also think that language-specific regulations or category regulations is sufficiently clear. That's what we're talking about. But I'm happy to be corrected or persuaded on both of those points. Does anybody have any comments on this language? Okay, hearing none, I'm inclined to say let's leave it as specific regulations.
Great.
Okay, let's go on to number 2. This is where we had some comments that came in this morning. I think you circulated them, Leanne. Can you read them for us?
Sure. So this came in from Richard Morgenstern and Art Frass, who said, we would suggest that a one-time retrospective analysis of key rules, a review assessing the various benefit and cost categories, including unanticipated effects and the distribution of these effects, would be a major step forward. In considering whether to establish additional periodic reviews for some rules, agencies should consider whether there would be diminishing returns to subsequent analytical reviews.
So I'm going to throw it to our consultants here to see what their reactions are. Is that language strikes me as fine, a good idea. I don't know if it's contrary to what we've already said. I mean, I would think that'd be inherent in a plan. But again, I'm going to ask, either Lori or Jonathan. How about Lori first?
Sure. I mean, I don't disagree with anything that Art and Dick said there, but I think, I don't know, I'll leave it to you all to decide if it needs to be wordsmith. But when I read, we're on this one, when agencies adopt new regulations for which decisions regarding retrospective review have not been established, they should, as part of that rulemaking, decide whether those regulations should be subject to retrospective review. I guess you could be more specific and say exactly what criteria they should use in making that decision. If you want to spell it out in quite as much detail as Dick and Art did. I think this is fine, but I also understand that they might want it to be more spelled out exactly what agencies should be thinking about when they're making the decision about whether those regulations should be subject to retrospective review, periodic retrospective review.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I took the spirit of Art Frost and Dick Morgenstern's comment to be that, gee, it would be great if we could even get one retrospective review. And then further periodic review would be valuable, but could have diminishing returns. So I think our report, that's consistent with what we say in our report, which is that there are both pros and cons or benefits and costs of periodic review, and that we don't recommend it be kind of universal blanket. So as Lori just said, maybe this is a place to add something about, should consider whether additional periodic review is desirable, or maybe even some criteria. But I think we talked about this in the committee meeting 2 weeks ago, and it may be that it's already covered in a subsequent wording. But I think the general idea that agencies should consider whether the pros justify the cons of doing additional periodic review is a fine point.
Bill Funk.
I don't see much difference, but from what they recommended and what the current language is, considering the second sentence, I just don't, 6 of one, half dozen of the other. They've really not added anything that I can see. I don't see the difference between what we have and what they propose.
That's my sense as well. But I also know that that's why we have committees. So Bridget.
Hello. Yeah, I think it's sort of like the way to operationalize the comment would be to have a first recommendation that just endorses any retrospective review at least once, and then before launching into the periodic question, because starting from and it makes sense because the topic of this report is periodic. So we just sort of jump into that. But I think what they're saying is it might not be a bad idea to just reinforce the merits of doing it at least once.
That's right, though I think we do that in the introduction.
And we do have other ACUS recommendations on that topic as well, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so in the interest of moving along, what do folks think? Do we want to change the language here in response to this first comment? Or do we think that the first comment we all agree with and we think it's already subsumed in the language that we have, subject to making sure that we express support for retrospective review in the introduction? Does anybody disagree with that?
Aaron, I'm sorry to break in again, but actually when I look at it, I do see there's one substantive difference between our current language and their proposal. And that is, we say agencies should establish the regime, and they say they should decide whether to establish a regime. And that's something we discussed in the last meeting and decided on the basis of past ACUS recommendations that it was not improper for us to say they should have a retrospective regime. Whether or not what rules, if any, would be subject to it would be another question. But that this statement of we should stay in there as opposed to just should decide whether.
Yeah, I agree with that. We did spend a good chunk of last meeting on that point. So I'd like to stick with what we have there, again, subject to, if anyone wants to push back on that. All right, hearing none, I'm inclined to say let's keep what we have. But Bill, you're the next person online because the next comment is the language that you added, which I think is also part of what we're talking about here. So do you want to explain your proposal, or are folks?
I can. My proposal was, it's essentially a two-part type of proposal. The first one part of it here is that we deal with a regime that sort of says, look at the existing rules. And what do you do about rules that come up that are adopted newly that were never subject to this consideration in the first place as to whether or not there should be a retrospective review. So my proposal is that when agencies adopt new regulations for which there had been no decision regarding retrospective review, that in the course of that rulemaking, they decide whether or not they should do retrospective review of the rule they adopt.
As I recall from last meeting, there was general agreement that that was a good idea, but I want to make sure that our consultants, is that consistent with what the consultants report says? So maybe Jonathan, you can go first this time.
I want to say in general that I appreciate and welcome, as I said in our last committee meeting, welcome Bill Funk's suggestion that agencies could decide how to set the frequency if they have discretion. On this particular sentence on line 67 through 70, my reaction is only to ask whether this should be done in each new regulation at the time of initial promulgation of the regulation, if that is what this sentence is saying, or if the decision on whether the regulation should be subject to retrospective review could also happen later. And for many existing regulations, we're already, well, I guess this is only applying to new regulations. So just a question of whether this decision should happen at the time of initial promulgation or could also be done later.
Robert Gerard.
Yes, I think that for the most part, the text is a good idea, that agencies should consider how to do retrospective review for their new rules. But I think that in line 69, I would like to take out the phrase "as part of that rulemaking," because that implies that there's actually a rulemaking obligation to codify the retrospective review or to document it in the supplementary information or something of that kind, which I don't think agencies should be tied up with.
Bill, do you have any response?
I don't have any objection to it. It was the idea that would actually that they'd get public comment on the question as to whether or not they should do retrospective rulemaking as part of it. But I agree it's not going to be part of the rule that is adopted as a legally binding requirement. I agree with that. So I don't have any problem taking it out.
And real fast, Bill, on Jonathan's point, do you think you're in agreement with him about this only applies to new regulations and not the existing stack?
Exactly. We're going to adopt new regulations for which decisions have not been made. And that's the whole idea, is that we've set up this system, look at all your regulations that you have now, but what happens about new regulations that occur later? And it's possible that they could sometime after that decide whether or not to do a retrospective review, but this is sort of an action forcing event, which is to say, when you do the rulemaking, that's a very good time to think about whether you should do retrospective rule or not, put it off to some later time, which might mean you put it off indefinitely and never do it.
Lori.
I was just going to note that this edition only talks about retrospective review and not periodic retrospective review. It may be embedded in there that for new regulations, they're deciding whether or not to do one and how often. But it's just a note that the recommendations, I think, are supposed to be about periodic retrospective review, and this one doesn't actually use the word periodic. Or this last sentence does not.
That was I mean, the problem here is this question of what is periodic review? Does it mean every 5 years? Or does it mean we'll do it in 5 years and then at that point we'll decide when or whether to do it again? And so the idea that, as we'll see later, that there's an option for the proposal is for it to be an option. Instead of doing an every 5 years type of system, it would be to say, we're going to do a retrospective review at 5 years, and at that point we'll decide when to do another retrospective review, if at all. And that's we try to put that within the term, the definition of a different form of periodic review. So that was the reason not to put it in there.
Lori, does that do the trick for you?
It's fine with me.
What a good soul.
I agree with everything in there. I just was trying to make sure that people understood that our report was really focused on periodic retrospective review.
David.
I just want to address the issue of striking as part of the rulemaking. I think the valid intent here is that the decision on conducting a retrospective review, it should be part of the decision-making process that goes into the original rulemaking itself, and that is a valid question that the public should be engaged on. So even if it's not part of the rulemaking, as in codified as part of the rule, I think that there is room in here for inviting the public to be part of the conversation.
Claire.
Hi, this is kind of picking up on that as well. And I don't have an opinion as to whether or not it should be part of the public comment process, but I think that just taking out as part of the rulemaking, you should replace it with something to indicate that there's an established agency, internal agency process, or maybe just established process to for someone coming in later, they'll understand whatever the thought process was as to why a decision was made to either have or not have the retrospective review.
So either maybe Claire or David or Dave. David, do you prefer Dave or David?
I generally go by Dave. Thank you.
Okay, Dave. Do either one of you have proposed language we can put in there so we can look at it?
You could say should follow an established process to decide.
Dave, does that do the trick for you?
I'm a little concerned by the implication that there is an established process for a question like this. Perhaps we move the clause to say agencies should decide whether those regulations should be subject to retrospective review as part of the rulemaking process. To eliminate the idea that it's part of the rulemaking, i.e. the rule, but rather part of the process that an agency goes through to develop a rule.
Claire, does that work for you?
Yeah, that's yeah.
And who had the original objection? I'm sorry, I missed that.
It's Robert Gerard.
Yeah, I think it was Robert. Robert, does that work for you?
Yeah, I think that works for me.
Okay. Does anybody want to be heard on this point? Okay, if not, we'll go with it for now. Again, we'll get one more chance on all of this. So this isn't like when Matt does it at the plenary and then we're done. But for now, we'll go with that language. Okay, next we have number 3. What is the comment on number 3?
This is language that was proposed by Bridget Dooling during the last committee in response to, I think, Dave Rosker's comments.
Okay, Bridget, do you want to explain them?
Yes, I think I remember this one. It's on a very tiny screen, so pardon me, I'm like leaning very closely. But Dave remembers what his point was. Go for it, Dave. I yield my time.
Dave, you have the floor.
We go. Yes, the point I was making here was that in the discussion of the recommendation, we use the term rule and rulemaking, but periodic review may be more appropriate to talk about programs or sets of rules rather than what is simply defined by a final notice of rulemaking. And so this paragraph actually captures that very well. The idea that periodic retrospective review may be more appropriate on a programmatic basis rather than limited to particular notices in the past.
So as I recall last meeting, I don't remember any pushback to the concept. If anybody opposes either the concept or the specific language that Bridget has offered, please speak up. Okay, going. All right, we'll take that as well. Thank you, Bridget. Thank you, Dave. And now we're on number 4. What is the comment bubble there? Oh, that's from Bill. Bill, do you want to take the floor again?
Yes, this is the idea that we have at least two different kinds of periodic retrospective review. One is the more traditional known one where you say every 5 years or every 7 years or something. And the other is you say, I'm going to do a retrospective review of this rule or these rules in 5 years. And in that retrospective review, I will then decide when the next retrospective review should take place, if at all. And the idea is that this is actually beneficial because it means you have, when you do that first retrospective review, you'll have more knowledge about what the right time is, whether the first time that you set was a good one, whether there's a need for it in the future, rather than indefinitely every 5 years without sort of reconsidering that notion. And I think that idea is in John's report, that the idea that you actually can get some more information. There's I'd say there's some criticism for these arbitrary dates that go on into the future. And so this idea that you'd actually be setting a date based on some information would be beneficial.
So based on what I have heard already, my sense is that Jonathan and Lori do not disagree conceptually with this. So let's do conceptually first. Is that true, John and Lori, or anyone else in the committee? Do we agree conceptually that this makes sense? And if so, then we'll talk about the actual language.
Yes,
Jonathan.
I think we do. Lori and I have not discussed the specific language, but yes. And also, I think one thing that's valuable about this is that it nudges the agency to address the question of what the optimal period, the optimal frequency, which is one point that we said in our report has kind of been under-attended by agencies and by Congress, which just sometimes just sets a fixed period.
Anyone else on the committee or Lori?
Yeah, I
do
don't
have any
disagree.
conceptual problems? No disagreement? I'm sorry, Lori.
Sorry, I was gonna say I don't disagree in general, but I could imagine folks being worried that if it's left completely to the agency to decide at each point when they might want to do this again, that they might decide not ever to do it again, even when it would be good. I mean, that's something we heard a little bit in the interviews, that having their feet held to the fire with sometimes very ambitious, maybe too ambitious timelines, like every 5 years, actually did mean that they got things done. So, I mean, there's a trade-off. I like the idea that you could decide what the optimal frequency is. I worry a little bit that there are a lot of political pressures to not do it at all if you have that flexibility.
Hey, anyone else? That was really helpful, Lori. Anyone else with conceptual thoughts? And if not, we'll get to language and see if we can maybe resolve both of those concerns. So right now, conceptually, are we all on board with the idea, if not necessarily the implementation of the idea? Okay, I'm not hearing none. What language can we add? I guess, first of all, Bill, what do you think about Lori's concern? And is there a way that we can massage the language to address that concern?
Well, actually, I think the language currently already does address it, because it says that when you set the first date and then you do the next retrospective review, it says then you set a new date. It doesn't say or no date. It says at each point you set a new date. It doesn't say or no date. I suppose it's possible, but at least as far as the recommendation goes, it assumes or presumes that at each stage you will be setting a new date.
Or consciously deciding that a future date is not necessary, but you would be making that decision too.
But that is not in the language here. I mean, that might be something that an agency might do, but it's not within anything that we're recommending. We're recommending setting a new date. So I think inevitably it could be that they would say the new date is never. But I think at least this is somewhat responsive to Lori's point that we're not inviting them to say, no, we're not going to do another one.
Lori or anybody else, response? Lori?
No, I think that's fair. He's absolutely right that the language says, you know, with a subsequent date. So, I mean, it's a concern, but but he's correct that it's not a concern with the language here per se.
Okay, does anybody have language edits that they would like to add? And again, we'll get another shot at it, but hearing none, we'll accept what we have right now and we'll move on. Thank you, Bill. All right, now we're at the list of factors to consider, which we didn't quite make it all the way through. Leanne, do you remember how far we got?
I think we made it through D and we ran into the question of what the word complexity means in E and then called it quits for the day.
Yeah, that sounds like what I would have done. All right, so we're at E, complexity. And we have a comment. Leanne, can you read the comment for us?
Yeah, this is from the Institute for Policy Integrity, which says subsection E suggests that a less complex rule warrants more frequent reviews. Why this may be is not clear, and the subsection requires more explanation. And I think what I would add to this is we had some internal discussion about the use of the word complexity. This language is drawn from a previous recommendation, but we had some feelings that it might not be the most accurate word for what the second half of the sentence is talking about in this context. So somebody may have a better word to capture what's happening in this subsection.
Yeah, and conceptually, I'll throw this to either Lori or Jonathan. I guess I struggle to understand why less complexity may warrant more frequent reviews. It would seem to me that the more complex, the more things can go wrong and more we have to worry about. So I might just be misunderstanding what we mean by complexity. So maybe Jonathan, will you take a stab at this?
Yeah, Aaron, I agree with you. I don't think this language came from our report. I think, as Leanne just said, this came from a previous ACUS recommendation, I think, or I'm not sure where.
Yeah.
So I understood the first sentence of little e to be saying that where it becomes evident that regulated parties are having trouble complying, or where there are disputes like poor compliance rates, additional clarifying guidance, remands from the courts, that might be evidence for the need for more periodic review, because there's some, perhaps, possibly some problem with the rule that could be improved by updating it. So then the second sentence about complexity more or less may warrant more frequent reviews did seem to me possibly should be deleted or should be revised.
I think I can shed some light on what may have happened here, which is that I think one of the words we were toying with is clarity, which I'm not sure the committee is going to want, but the clarity of the regulation, you would say less clarity may warrant more frequent reviews. And I think probably less did not get changed back to more in all of the back and forth editing.
Okay, well, that makes sense to me. Okay, so Jonathan or Lori, if the language is changed to more complexity rather than less complexity, is that strike you as consistent with what you found in your interviews?
Well, excuse me, Lori, I'll just jump in to say, I agree that more is the better direction. The word complexity means other things to me than the kinds of problems that are illustrated in the first sentence. So complexity to me has to do with complex causal interactions, and there's a whole other set of literature and issues about complexity. So about interconnectedness, but that's not really what this is talking about. So perhaps besides complexity, a better word might be might have something to do with difficulty of implementation or obstacles to successful implementation. Maybe that's not even the best language.
I was just going to agree that what we found, the bulk of this sentence, poor compliance rates, amount of clarifying guidance, remands from the court, like those things should trigger more frequent review. That's from the report. But I wouldn't call that complexity. And I don't know if I would call it difficulty of implementation either. It's more like a mismatch between the regulation and lots of things, like all the things that we say there. I don't have one word for that, but like, the industry's ability to comply, what the values are that are reflected in through the court system and other things. It's like it's a regulatory mismatch somehow rather than complexity.
Dave.
Yeah, there's an interesting mismatch here because we're talking about things that we want the agency to consider during at the beginning of the rulemaking process. Yet here is a standard which is based upon things that we learn after the rule is issued. That said, I think that perhaps the language might be regulations for which regulated entities have demonstrated difficulty in compliance.
Jonathan? Dave, we'll go back to that language. I just thought Jonathan had a quick comment.
Just my other quick comment is looking at 4E, it seems to be raising a similar issue to what's in 4D about comments, complaints, requests for waivers or exemptions. I think we also use the word variances in the report. So that could be combined, those little, perhaps, unless there's some other reason, little D and E could be combined so that the examples of poor compliance rates, clarifying guidance, remands from the courts could be included in the list that's in 4D. And then there could be a sentence that says the more of these difficulties or the greater potentially for more periodic review or more frequent.
I like that. Maybe let's let Leanne, who has the hardest job in the meeting, have a second to write, and then see what that looks like. And once she's done with that, Dave, I'll let you have the floor.
Okay, I think I put the factors from E into D. I don't know if it's grammatically correct, but they're there.
Okay, Dave?
Yeah, I do not disagree with the idea that D and E have some overlap, but I don't want to lose the elements of that second sentence of D, which is the idea of significant new evidence, which is a different side of difficulty in compliance or poor compliance rates.
So do you think it can be D and E mixed together, or do you think we should just keep them separate?
I think maybe D and E mixed together, but then split again, because the elements of E that we bring into D are really the relationship of the regulated entities to the regulation itself. And then there's the element of public interest and new evidence that may justify a change in the regulation. I see those as two distinct items, and it may just be that we've got two paragraphs that need to be blended and split in a new way. And so it would be comments, complaints, requests for waivers, exemptions, poor compliance rates. It seems like we need to bring the language from E, that is, rules that have demonstrated difficulty in compliance as demonstrated by comments, complaints, and then separately, the level of public interest or the amount of new evidence regarding changing regulation may warrant more frequent reviews.
Bill Funk.
Well, I was going to argue that D and E are really talking about two different things and therefore should be separate. But D is really talking about evidence from the public or evidence from outside of interest in the rule that would justify more frequent reconsideration, whereas the E talks about difficulties in the actual implementing of the regulation or difficulties arising out of trying to implement the regulation separate from specific public interest in it. So I just thought they were two different concepts that were being involved here. And I just thought that E could be difficulties arising from implementation, and then give the examples as demonstrated, blah, blah, blah.
I agree. So now I'm speaking as committee member, not as committee chair. I think I'm where Bill is. That makes more sense to me conceptually. But I want to hear if anybody disagrees, because I think then we would just keep D as we had it, which I thought was in pretty good shape, and just change the intro to E. And I think the E made sense, and maybe drop the last sentence from E. I don't think we need that if we have the first clause of the, as Bill articulated it. So now this is let me, if we were all in person, I would now look around the room at everybody's face and get a sense for what people are thinking. I can't do that now. So, you know, if someone wants to speak up, I'll let you have the floor in a second, Dave. But if I'm not hearing anybody, I'm going to put the default at the Funk Nielsen default. And if I don't hear anything, I'll assume that's where people are. Dave.
Then I might suggest moving requests for waivers or exemptions into E.
Bill?
I don't feel strongly. I mean, it just, again, request for waivers or exemptions is sort of an external expression of interest, but it also could be equally difficulty of implementation. So that's fine with me.
It could also go in both. I don't know how anybody feels about that.
Not strongly.
How about this? How about we do it right now in both? We'll get a chance to look at it. So Leanne, if you can do your best here as a placeholder, we'll have another shot to have this clean. I want to make sure this idea is preserved. So tell me when you think you've got the idea preserved. Then we'll fix the language, and then we'll have it for next meeting.
Are we officially going back to the original version of D, and I should reject all of the track changes I've put in?
Yes.
Okay.
Aaron, can I make a suggestion on E to keep the last sentence, although rephrase it? I mean, to be parallel with all the other sections, the last sentence always says something rather.
Okay.
And just say more difficulties may warrant more frequent reviews.
Okay.
Or greater difficulties, but more difficulties, that's better.
Okay. All right. So we're going to have a shot at this one. Leanne, make sure that we have a comment bubble for next time, that we know that we're going back to this.
I guess my other question is there a general, we have so many options for how we're wording the beginning of this sentence. Is there a general feeling, is the one that Bill suggested, the difficulties arising from implementation, the general favorite?
I believe so. That is my favorite.
Okay.
Though again, I want to, if anyone speaks up, like I'm not ignoring you, I just can't see you. All right, yes, then not hearing none, that's what we'll go with, and we'll look at it for next time. Thank you.
Great.
All right. Okay, now we are on F. We're on new material. This is great. This is wonderful. All right, F. The administrative burden in conducting reviews. Greater staff time involved in reviewing the regulation may warrant less frequent reviews. Okay. All right. I'm throwing it out to the committee. Conceptually, are we on board with this? Dave, is this a new comment, or is this to the past one? I can't remember.
Last one.
Okay, great. All right. Anybody comments on the concept? Okay. Comments on the language? Okay. All right. Let's go to the next one. G. Reliance interest connected with the regulation. Regulations on which regulated entities and beneficiaries have come to rely with higher costs of change may lend themselves to less frequent reviews. I'm going to say right here, I know we've had this in other committee meetings. When we talk about regulated entities and beneficiaries, some people think that is too narrow of a universe. We often want to include the public as well. Do we need to include the public here? Bill says no.
Here, I mean, it's the public that is neither regulated nor a beneficiary, I don't know how they come to rely on something.
Anybody else? Okay, Nina Olson.
Yeah, I have a comment on 4F and I just couldn't get my comment thing in.
Okay, great.
Unmuted in time. I'm actually having a little bit of a problem on the second half of that, I mean, I understand that you should consider administrative burden in conducting the reviews, but if something is, for example, a regulation that encounters difficulties arising from implementation, it should not matter whether it takes more staff time. You know, it may really warrant more frequent reviews because it's a quickly changing industry or something. So I'm not sure I can agree. You know, I have difficulty with that last half. I don't have a problem with considering the administrative burden in conducting the reviews as a factor, but I have a problem with the sort of the second sentence.
Leanne, isn't the first introduction to this list identify them as factors to consider?
Yes.
So then I don't see why we need the second half of the sentence.
I think the second half of the sentence is just as explanation for why that might be relevant. I mean, could it be relevant in the other direction?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Is that, or I'm, well. My cat agrees with me.
Nina, it seems to me that, you know, you have E that says, you know, there's problems with this thing, and D that says there's a lot of people who are interested in this thing, and maybe that's going to result in them taking more staff time. But the point is, these are just issues to weigh against one another. And, you know, I agree with you. It may very well be that the things that really trigger more frequent reviews in E are probably going to require more staff time, but that means that E will outweigh F in that regard. So it's just a factor to be considered. I don't think when it says may warrant, that's all.
All right, well, I'll cede that. It stuck out to me, whereas the others I did not have the same reaction to. And I'm not articulating it very well, but I am concerned.
How about this? In the interest of moving, can you think of some language that might address your concern that we can really look at in this meeting or in the next?
Sure, yep.
Perfect, thank you. John, you're back on G.
I'm not clear what reliance interest means. Does that mean affected interests? Reliance interest doesn't sound, it's not intuitive to me what that means.
Lori or John?
Is it affected interest?
Well, Aaron, if you're calling on me.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure we drafted this, but regardless, I think the word reliance there might be invoking the legal concept of parties who have relied on an existing rule or existing law. So they've made investments or life decisions based on what they think the rule or the law is. That's what reliance is probably referring to there.
And just so we're clear,
the sentence says that.
When I call on John or Lori, it's not because I think that you necessarily wrote the language. It's because you are closer to what the concerns that were expressed in the agency review process. So that's why I'm calling it. So when I say that,
sure.
Either good or bad. But if the language is great, I'm not saying good job. Or when the language is bad, I'm not saying that's what I'm trying to do there. For me, I'll speak. I understand reliance interest. It makes intuitive sense to me what we're saying here. But John is usually right. So I like to. So thanks for speaking up. Is there anybody who shares John's confusion about what we mean by reliance interest, or agrees with John and my sense of it, but nonetheless thinks we shouldn't have it? Okay, I'm not hearing it. I think reliance interest makes sense. Is there a way, John, that we can address your concern? Affected interests, I'm not sure what it's ad hoc. It's not a term that I'm aware of. I know reliance interests. I don't know what those
Well,
are.
I'm not a lawyer, so that it just didn't sound intuitive to me with what was meant. Another question I have about the same thing, it says entities and beneficiaries have come to rely on the presidential memorandum to review regulations for unintended inequities, social inequities, are not a beneficiary, they're an affected interest. So do you intend to only look at people that are positively affected, or could be inadvertently negatively affected as well in this context of this section?
Comments from the committee? Jonathan?
Well, I certainly agree that all those affected, that their impacts and their concerns should be considered in the retrospective or periodic review, as well as an ex ante impact analysis. So, but I think what little g is talking about is the subset of people who have come to rely on the existing law, whereas those who are adversely affected by ancillary impacts or inequities are not necessarily those who have come to rely on the rule.
Okay.
But I agree with the broader point that in assessing the social well-being impacts and distributional equity, we should consider not only the regulated actors and the target beneficiaries, but also the other communities who may be affected.
Okay. I don't have a proposed change, but I just wanted to flag just a couple of things.
Jonathan, do you think that concern about other folks is captured by some of the first factors? Change of society, things of that sort. Is that already included, or should we add something more specific?
Yeah, we do have in 4A, the society affected by the regulation.
So my sense is that it's there, and that and that G can stand as by itself.
But
okay.
And and Aaron, it might be that later in these recommendations, is there a recommendation that refers to the scope of the review, which impacts should be considered in the review? I think we do talk about benefits, costs, ancillary impacts, and distributional equities someplace. I hope we do in these recommendations.
Yeah, I think that we do. All right. Let's put a pin on it. Let's make sure that we have that before we're done. All right, Bill Funk, and then Robert.
I was just going to say that the term reliance interest is a known term in the law. It's been used in 80-some Supreme Court decisions, so I don't think it's particularly problematic.
Okay, Robert?
Yeah, I agree with that. When I read reliance interests, I automatically thought investment-backed expectations, although if some clarification is needed, we could say reliance interests and investment-backed expectations. My other comment on this is I don't think that it's only regulated entities and beneficiaries that have reliance interests. It's also the public. To give an example, a farmer or a landowner may have significant reliance interests in an environmental regulation affecting wetlands, but that is neither a regulated party nor a beneficiary. So I'd like to see the public added.
So there's two ways we can do it. We can add the public, which was how I kicked us off. The other way we can do it to kind of match what we've done in the others is we could say, greater reliance may lend itself to less frequent review, which would match what we did in F, and then not explained by what we mean by that. We're just, the entire universe of reliance is included. Does that do the trick for you, Robert?
My concern is the line above where we refer to
Yeah, we'd get rid of that sentence. We'd replace it with that.
Yeah, I think that works for me.
And okay, anybody else? Does anybody want to push back on that one? Okay, all right. Again, people will get another shot at it. I also welcome comments between drafts, but as of now, I think we are through 4. So good job, everybody. Let's see what we can do here with 5. I'm also happy we've done this for an hour. Do people need a 5-minute break, or can we keep powering through? Okay, all right, let's keep powering through because I want to get as much as we can done because I certainly don't want a 4th meeting. So let's see what we can do here with 5. And there we have a comment. I don't quite see the comment. Can you tell me what the comment is, Leanne?
So I think they had put, this is from the Institute for Policy Integrity, and I think it resembles something they had commented on 3D, which is that the content of public input should weigh more heavily in these determinations than the sheer volume of public input.
Correct. Okay. And I don't think anybody disagrees with that. This isn't just a numbers game. It's quality rather than quantity, but quantity is still relevant. So let's see if we can make sure we capture that. So the language that we have here is in making the decisions recommended in recommendations 1 through 3, public input can help agencies identify which regulations should be subject to review and with what frequency. Agencies should consider soliciting public input by means such as convening meetings of interested persons, engaging in targeted outreach efforts to affected interests that do not normally monitor agencies' activities, creating online discussion forums designed to solicit feedback, and posting requirements for information. So I'm going to get us kicked off. Though I agree with all of that. The one that gives me the most heartburn is creating online discussion forums designed to solicit feedback. And this is just a question that I have that maybe Reeve or Matt just might know the answer to. Has ACUS ever chimed in on online discussion forums? Have we done this before? Something we can cross-reference? Because otherwise, I don't know if this is the right place to create kind of a new concept.
Yeah, happy to respond. I think the short answer is no, at least with respect to developing the idea itself. Leanne, could you remind me, is that language actually taken from 2014-5, or is that something new that's been added?
I don't know for sure. I know that this concept appears in the report on public engagement, and I think that something along these lines came up in the recommendation associated with that, but I'm not sure if this identically matches it.
Okay. You might double check on that, but it sounds like, Aaron, essentially, I think we might have been drawing this language from a previous recommendation, just as something that, I think it was similarly, if I recall correctly, listed in an enumerated, list of this sort, just as one possibility. I don't think we spent a whole lot of time developing the concept itself, but I think it was just sort of listed as one option that agencies might consider.
I mean, if we've done this before, it gives me less heartburn because then we can say like, we've done this before, and you can look at where we've discussed this idea before. So we're not just throwing out something new that people don't know quite what we mean by. But I would like to, I guess, see what we've said before on that one, because otherwise I think there'll be some confusion here about what this means. I don't even know what an online discussion forum would look like. Is it going to be like Reddit for EPA? I don't even know what that even means. So I'm a little bit concerned about that. Not the concept. I just don't even know what that would even look like. But the rest of it all makes sense to me. So now I'm going to throw it out to the group. Comments, reactions. Eloise is not with us today. I miss her. She's always great at these sorts of things.
I think she may be here soon. She suggested she would be joined for the last half of the meeting, I think.
Well, Eloise is my go-to person for wordsmithing, so we'll save it for wordsmithing. But does anybody else? If not, I'm okay with it, and I think that it's we capture the concern from the comment about volume because I thought we fixed that in the list. So if not, subject to the online forum thing, which I would like to have someone just look at between this meeting and next. Does anybody have concerns? If not, we can go on to the next one. Going, gone. Great. Okay, number 6. We have a couple of comments in number 6, and it's hard for me to see. My chat bubble is blocking those.
I can keep reading them.
Okay,
It's
please
fine.
do. Thank you.
So the first one is on the phrase agencies should include these notifications on their websites. And the Institute for Policy Integrity commented that agencies should also consider detailing plans for retrospective review in their annual regulatory plans. Executive Order 12866 calls for agencies to do so. I think the second comment is related because this one is for me on the Federal Register and Code of Federal Regulations publication suggestion. This lines up with what we recommended in rules on rulemakings in 2021. But we were uncertain if the committee would agree that in this particular case, it should be published in both the Federal Register and the Code of Federal Regulations. So all of this is about how many places do agencies need to put these.
Okay, Robert.
Sorry, I had trouble unmuting. I'm thinking the Federal Register makes sense because it seems like statements of the course and method of functions under FOIA 5 USC 552 A1B. I think under the FOIA, it's the kind of thing that agencies ought to publish in the Federal Register when they can. I don't think the Code of Federal Regulations, because under the Federal Register Act, like under 44 USC 1510, the CFR is really supposed to be reserved for rules of general applicability and legal effect of a fairly permanent character. And I don't think that this really would fall into that.
For what it's worth, this is me as committee member, not as committee chair. I agree with that, but there's a lot of smart folks on the committee here. Does anybody disagree? Okay, hearing none. Now we have the comment about EO 12866. And I confess, I do not remember that part of 12866 off the top of my head. Somebody who is closer to this, is that correct? Maybe Jonathan or one of our folks who just, Bridget or somebody from OIRA, is that consistent with 12866?
Aaron, I think that might be referring to Section 5 of EO 12866, which does call on agencies to develop plans for periodic review of their existing regulations. Whether it also calls for them to put it in their annual regulatory plans, I would have to check back at the language, or maybe that's in a different part of 12866. But in any event, isn't that already in ACUS recommendation 2014-5? I don't know if that needs to be repeated here for periodic review.
Okay, well, now you've got me another one. I don't remember what we said in our 14th recommendation at that point either. Reeve, do you know what we said in 2014 on that?
Sorry, do you mind reminding me of the question, Aaron?
So the question is, we're looking at their comment and they say that we should consider detailing, agencies consider detailing the plans for retrospective review in their annual regulatory plans. And they're saying that that's required by 12866. And according to Jonathan, we've already talked about this in our prior recommendation. So the question is, do we need to reiterate that here? And I'm at a double disadvantage because I don't remember that from 12866 or our prior recommendation.
Yeah, so I'd have to go back and double check myself. That sounds right. I do remember briefly discussing this in the context, I think, of 2014-5. I'll have to take a closer look at it, but I do believe that it's discussed in that context. So yeah, it seems like additional discussion here would probably be unnecessary unless we want to somehow reiterate it. But
well, because we're definitely going to, in the preamble to the recommendation, we're going to cross-reference that earlier recommendation. So I'm inclined to say that that cross-reference would be enough and we don't need to repeat it here. But I want to make sure that, we're not, I always want agencies to follow the law, and including EOs. So I want to make sure that we're not somehow implicitly saying by excluding it that they don't have to do what they're already required to do. And Joseph O'Connell.
I read Executive Order 12866 and the regulatory plan requirements under Section 4 of the Executive Order to not include that a review is going to be ongoing, because I've worked with the regulatory plans and the unified regulatory agenda, and the items are about, intended proposed rules, intended final rules, and what, as I understand it, what we're talking about here is something preliminary to that, because you could do this review and not change the regulation at all, and not even propose to change the regulation.
Okay, I'm also looking at Jonathan put the language from section 5 in the comments. Okay, so let's see, based on what Anne says, so do you think that we leave it as it is? Is that the takeaway from your comment? Anne, I'm sorry.
Well, now I'm looking at, so I was looking at Section 4 and Jonathan is looking at Section 5, and it does seem that it says, right, he has a line at the very end, if I'm reading the comment bubble correctly, right, that any significant regulations selected for review do have to go into the annual plan. So it seems like a subset of stuff has to go into the plan, but not everything has to go in the plan. Is that how you read it, Jonathan?
Yes.
All right, so this is what I think what we need to do here. I hate getting involved in complicated legal analysis on the fly. We're going to look at what we said in our 2014 recommendation. I assume the 2014 recommendation somewhat touches on this already, in which case I'm inclined to say we're just going to cross-reference our other recommendation and not recreate the wheel here. Maybe it doesn't, so in which case then we'll flag this for next meeting. So is that something that I can task Leanne or the staff to go back and confirm what we said in 2014 and see if we need to get into this here?
Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Anne, for that.
Just Aaron, just one thing. Leanne, could you also just, on the next draft, could you just clean up paragraph 6 here? It's just too wordy. Agencies should provide public disclosure regarding, it should just say agencies should publicly disclose or something along those lines.
Yep.
Okay, so we'll go back to this one once we have more information. So, let's just leave this as with a pin and make sure that we clean that up for next time. Anybody else other than that, comments on 6? Okay, hearing none, we'll go to 7. And it looks like Bill Funk has a comment. Bill.
Yeah, this is really just a technical thing. It used to say that agencies should periodically reassess the regulations that should be subject to retrospective review. And I just wanted to say it's the preset schedule that we're going to go back and look at, because the alternative way of doing it means you'll be looking at it each time. So this is
this is just, yeah, this is just tied to what we just accepted 30 minutes ago.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense to me. Anybody else? Okay, hearing none. I think we're okay there with the first suite of recommendations. Though let's just kind of pause before we go to the second suite. Is there anything else in here that we wanted to make sure was included? So we've got good language, but conceptually, is there anything else that we just wanted to add? In particular, we talked about, Jonathan mentioned, we want to make sure that this is including, all affected communities. Would that fall within this suite, or would this fall in the second suite of recommendations? Your comment there.
If you're asking me, Aaron, I wanted to look later in the document. I'm searching it right now.
Okay.
On a different. So let's see, ancillary impacts are mentioned in the preamble, but not in the recommendations themselves. Looks like.
Yeah, so I'm not seeing it in the recommendations. It feels like that idea should be there. Either we put it in the reliance interest one, or we put it in someplace else. But that idea, I would think should be there.
Oh, maybe it goes in 4B, because up in 4B, we already mentioned benefits, costs, and distributional impacts.
Oh, correct. Okay.
So we could just, after the word costs, comma, could be inserted ancillary impacts, comma. And that would be consistent with OMB Circular A4. And also, I think with President Biden's memorandum on modernizing regulatory review from January 20th, they both refer to all those kinds of sets of impacts.
Okay, throwing this out now to the committee. I like that there. That works for me, but I want to make sure everybody else is on board with that. Any comments, concerns, reactions from the group? Okay, hearing none. Again, we'll have a shot at this. We'll circulate this before next meeting. So, if that gives you heartburn, think about it. But for now, we'll put it in there. Thank you for that. Let's go to the second suite of recommendations. All right, this is great. Let's just pause for a second. I know that I suspect some of you after the first meeting was like, we're never gonna get this finished in 3 meetings. But we're making great progress. Things are coming through. We spend more time in the first to get sure we're all conceptually on board. So there we go. Thanks everybody for that. All right, number 8. We have a comment bubble. Leanne, can you share the comment bubble with us?
Yeah, so this one is also from the Institute for Policy Integrity, and they said such documentation should include a weighing of the costs and benefits of alternatives, and ACA should recommend that agencies consider a reasonable number of alternatives during their periodic reviews and should disclose information on the costs and benefits of those alternatives. And they also say if documents relating to retrospective review are to be posted on regulations.gov, they need to be readily findable. Such documents should be cross-linked as appropriate on agencies' own websites, and regulations.gov might feature some identifiable subsection on retrospective review.
Okay, I'm going to ask Jonathan and Lori to respond to this. But before I do, I think this might be a question for Reeve or for Matt. Correct me if I'm wrong, we already have some of those recommendations in other non-periodic retrospective review specific documents, right? About ability to find documents and cross-reference agencies on websites and things of that sort. Am I correct about that?
Yes, yeah, definitely with respect to, I think the prior retrospective review recommendations, yeah, we talk about how to make things findable and so forth. As to the reasonable number of alternatives.
Yeah, that one's different. That's a different thing. But the second half in particular, like how to find things, cross-reference things, clear web pages, things of that sort. I feel very confident we've done this before, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I do think we touch on that, yeah, in respect with the retrospective review thing and then previous recommendation. And then just generally, yeah, I mean, we've referred to sort of making, relevant documents available. So I think that's a fair characterization of the previous work.
Okay, I'm going to ask, again, another homework assignment for Leanne or the staff. If we can just see if we have something about that in some other place that we can maybe even include a cross-reference in the preamble. I don't want the Institute for Public Policy Integrity to think that we're blowing them off. I agree with everything they say about that. I just also don't think that we need to break new ground here because I think we've already said that before. So let's just make sure we're on that. The first half of their comment, though, that's what I wanted to throw to Jonathan or Lori. What do we think about that? About they should have a specific number of alternative considerations?
Well, I think it depends on what the nature of the review is, right? So if they're doing a review of the regulation and then they decide that they need to make a change, then they're back in, I would think they're back in RIA world where they're doing a full benefit cost analysis or regulatory impact analysis, and they have to identify different alternatives, et cetera. but they may do a review and discover that things are working well. Then do we want to say they have to compare it to a variety of alternatives? I know what they mean in terms of an RIA, and I don't disagree with them, but I'm not sure that it's appropriate for this for number 8.
Jonathan, and then Bill Funk.
Yeah, I agree with Laurie, and the reasonable number of alternatives, that language that's in the policy integrity comment, that seems to be what one would consider when considering a new rule, a proposed rule. I suppose in a periodic review that is a retrospective review, you would also need to consider the counterfactual scenario of how the world would have been without this rule. And so there might need to be consideration of alternative scenarios. But in both of those cases, I'm not sure that fits in this number 8, because number 8 is about publishing the documents, not about the content of the review. So maybe that this goes in a different place.
Yeah, Bill Funk.
I was going to make the exact same point that John just made, that if it goes anywhere, it shouldn't go here. But I would say, if you look at the title before recommendation 8, performing data analysis and soliciting public, this isn't the right title for what we have here. Because as Jonathan says, 8 is about publishing stuff. It's not performing any particular analysis. So I don't have new words for that, but it's not right at this point.
Yeah, it looks like I certainly agree with that. The performing data analysis, I'm not seeing any data analysis listed here, so that definitely should go. Should it be publishing? What's the noun? Publishing noun and soliciting public feedback on a regulation subject to periodic review. I'm wondering what the noun would be. Should a document or set of documents explaining how they conducted a periodic review. Publishing something.
Documentation?
Publishing results of periodic review.
But it's yeah, I mean, but this is about the process. They should publish what their process was. So publishing process of periodic review and soliciting comments.
Aaron, I read this first sentence of paragraph 8 as saying they should publish their explanation of each periodic review. So what they considered when they did it. So it is a little bit
okay.
more.
No, you're right. You're
results.
right. Okay. All right. The title. I'll pick on Bill. Bill, does that do the trick for you?
Yeah.
Does anybody disagree with that? Okay, with that title, then we certainly aren't going to incorporate alternatives here. So, you know, I think we will politely decline the comment unless anybody wants to push back. Jennifer.
This isn't pushback. This is just in case we're moving on from 8. So
we're not moving on from 8. We're moving on from the comment bubble on 8.
Okay,
and now we're going to talk about the substance of 8. But you have the floor, please.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm happy to wait until we talk about the substance of 8. But if we're
there,
I
think we're there. I think we're there.
Okay, great. So just my one comment was, I think the intention, I believe, of the first sentence is, you know, that agencies should publish a document or set of documents. And I think something about this is meant to say that they should like publish it, maybe like on their own websites. And then the second sentence is saying they should also include this document or set of documents on regulations.gov. And if that's not the intent, I think that we should somewhere also say that the agency should publish it on their own websites.
Yeah, I don't know where else they would publish the document.
Right.
Well, I mean, I guess I don't know, government printing office or something, but that doesn't make any sense to have a document and not have it on their website. Anybody else? Any comments to that? I agree with that, Jennifer, for what it's worth, as a committee member, not as the chair. Robert.
Yeah, I think that considering that I think all agencies use their websites as their public reading room under the eFOIA amendments, I would think that the most logical place for this stuff to be would be on the agency website.
All right, anybody want to push back or say me too, I guess? All right, hearing none, that I agree with that. Let's keep that language, and we should then add the also, which Leanne already did. Great on that. Anybody else? Any other thoughts on concept or language of recommendation 8? Okay, hearing none. Recommendation 9. Yeah, I'm getting tired too. All right, recommendation 9. We have a comment bubble on recommendation 9. Leanne, please.
So this is on the phrase affected interests that do not normally monitor the agency's activities. And the comment is from the Institute for Policy Integrity, who say, agencies may not know which groups are normally monitoring regulatory activities. This goal might be rephrased to focus on affected groups that are underrepresented in the agency's proceedings, or more generally on vulnerable communities that are disproportionately affected by the rule.
Okay, committee, what do we think? This is a question I suppose I'm going to ask people that are in government. Is this a null set of what they are talking about? Do you not know who is affected but not monitoring? It strikes me as conceptually that could exist, but you probably would know who they are. But I've never been there. I don't know. Okay, Nina says, I could agree with the concept behind the change, but could use wordsmithing. David, please have the floor.
Yeah, I appreciate the intent, but this is really no different than any other regulatory activity. There are affected interests on regular rulemakings that do not normally monitor the agency's activities. I don't know that this particular kind of rulemaking activity needs a particular call out to disproportionately non-represented entities any more than it would for any other activity. We just had an example with EPA issuing a rule, went through a ton of notice and comment, did a lot of outreach, and after, a month after the rule was published, an industry came in and said, hey, we didn't know about this, and here's a problem with the rule, and they had to. So, I mean, this isn't unusual. So unless there is pre-existing ACUS recommendations on how to conduct outreach to lesser aware parties, I don't know that this is the right place to have that conversation.
I think if I could comment that.
Yes, please have the floor.
Yeah, that I don't know where this fits, but it also goes back to, affected parties. Our conversation about affected parties, is it just limited to the regulated entities or the public at large? And it might be that I don't know whether ACUS has a recommendation about how do we get more engagement in the comment process, but it seems like that's where this concern would fit in. And maybe there's a place in one of our little recommendations here that we just talk in general about, agencies should take every effort to increase engagement in all of the comment process, including, and then, underrepresented, folks, et cetera. but I don't know that it necessarily needs to be. It doesn't fit here. It might even be somewhere in a preamble. I haven't looked at it to see where it might fit.
So this is always unfair. I expect Reeve to know everything that ACUS has ever done. But I do agree with Dave that, you know, this doesn't feel like this is the first time that this particular question would have come up. This would come up in any of our rulemaking committees, recommendations, I would think. How does the rulemaking committee typically deal with this?
So is the question, Aaron Moore, do we have anything that's on point that's come out of the rulemaking committee? Is that sort of what you're getting at?
That would be one way to answer the question. Another way would be in the rulemaking committee, we typically put all of this in the preamble as just kind of a broader idea of what outreach means, or whatever. I'm just trying to get a sense for, we do this a little bit, they do this all the time. How do they capture this concept, which I think everybody agrees with? We want to make sure that folks that have an interest in this, or who may interest, not in a legal sense, but even in a broader social sense in something, but doesn't know about it. We want them to know about it. How does the rulemaking committee, articulate that idea?
Yeah, so, I don't know that there's any sort of hard fast precedent here as to what they've worked on. I mean, and this may be another homework assignment. I think probably the closest thing is probably going to be our recommendation on early input. It was from 2018 or 2019. And I think, yeah, in terms of sort of fleshing out sort of exactly what that might look like, that probably is more appropriate for the preamble. And we could sort of take a look at that and sort of see how we massaged it there. And indeed, correct me if I'm wrong, Leanne, but I think some of this language is probably actually taken from that recommendation or was inspired by that recommendation in number 9, correct?
I think we included this partly in response to some of the new administration's language that has been coming out. And so I think it was perhaps more tailored to that than any previous recommendations, but I do think we addressed to some degree this in the preamble already.
Bill Funk says he has an answer to the question.
Well, one answer is at least the rulemaking committee is currently engaged in something called early input on regulatory alternatives.
Yes, they are.
And they include in their recommendation, I mean, it's still draft, so it's not final, but include in the recommendation, they consider factors such as affected groups that have otherwise been underrepresented in the agency's administrative process or may suffer adverse distributional effects. So, I mean, the idea that that you included in the actual recommendation, there's precedent for that, and at least what's going on presently in the rulemaking committee. And we have this same language underrepresented in the agency's administrative process, at least close to what we have. And if we wanted to be consistent, we could use that same language that they've used. Of course, they might change it back to what we have, but
I appreciate that because you're quoting my drafted language from that. I'm happy to make it consistent.
Yeah, well, I think, all right, I'm gonna give, again, I don't usually give this many homework assignments. I'm gonna give another homework assignment to Leanne on this one. Look at what we did in the other one. I think we should strive for consistency across. So maybe once we're done and they're done and it gets to the council level, we can figure that out. But there's no reason for us to be saying something separate here when they're focusing on the issue more specifically. I will also say that we need to be consistent internally in our document. So we have the same language in recommendation 3. So whatever we say in recommendation 3, we should say in recommendation 9. They should be the same list. And I'd like to be, to the extent we can, consistent with, whatever the rulemaking committee is doing. I don't have any conceptual problem with what they're saying here. I agree with them, but I also don't want to create a morass if we don't have to when other people have been working on this longer than we have. So one more homework assignment, Leanne. Thank you for being a good soldier. I appreciate it.
Of course.
All right, anybody else? Subject to that language that we're gonna make sure we're consistent across internally with this document and across documents. Anybody other thoughts, reactions to 9? Okay, hearing none, we are at 10. And as I recall, We have somebody from OMB in the committee meeting today. Is that correct?
I'm not sure if Steph Tatham is still on.
Okay, I'm not hearing any reactions from OMB. Maybe I will ask Bridget, who is former OMB. What do you think OMB's reaction to that would be? And it's not fair. We'll make sure we'll check with them before next time. So this is just to move the ball along. Well, Bridget is no longer on the call either. All right, plenty of former OMBers are on the call. Somebody from OMB or as former OMB, we're gonna make sure before this thing gets voted on that OMB has a chance to look at that or our representative from OMB. But does that give anybody heartburn that this is something that they might not want extra responsibility put on their shoulders on this one?
This is Dave Rosker, former OIRA.
Yeah, Dave, please.
During the Obama administration, CAS issued multiple memos on these flexibilities. So I imagine since the term is properly invoked and work with OMB, the explanation is this simply refers back to OMB's issuances on flexibility, so that shouldn't be an issue.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? But we will make sure that the OMB representative gets a chance to look at this one. Because again, I don't want to surprise anybody with saying, hey, here's some more things that you can do without them ever having a chance to look at it. Anybody else? All right, so before we go to the next suite here, is there anything else we want to add for this section of public outreach? I don't think that there's anything that we're missing here, but I very well could be. So anybody from the committee, is there something here that we're missing? Nina, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you're very good at this. Is there anything that we're missing about making sure that the public is seeing the information?
Oh, you're putting me on the spot.
But I'm putting you on the spot with a nice compliment first, so it's okay.
I think that resolving the issue of where we're going to refer to underrepresented groups is what I think.
Okay.
One unaddressed issue, somewhere, and you've got a plan for how to deal with that.
Okay, perfect. All right, so then subject to that, I agree. We're gonna make sure that we're consistent and we're saying good things on that. Subject to that, let's see what we can do with the next suite here. And then if so, maybe that's where we will end today. Let's see what we can do here with 11, ensuring adequate resources and staffing. And I will confess, this is where I'm gonna need help from, I always need help, but even more help from the committee, because I have never worked in government on this sort of thing. And I wanna make sure that we are sensitive to that situation. Things I just don't know, I don't even know. So we have a comment first. I'll let Leanne share the comment, and then I want to hear some reactions from folks who have more expertise than me.
Sure. So this one is from Richard Morgan, Stern and Art Frass again. And they said, we recommend that agencies should develop arrangements that encourage independent third-party retrospective review. Such arrangements could involve the collection and public distribution of key data and or the support of independent retrospective studies administered by NSF or other scientific bodies.
I'm going to throw that, again, I'm just being unfair to everybody right now. I'm going to ask Lori or Jonathan for their reactions to that. Did this come up during your interview process during the report, or is this just a completely new idea that might be worth considering but doesn't fit with what you found during the interview process?
Lori, do you want to speak to that, or I have some responses also.
Why don't you start?
So I think this is a promising idea. I think there is an element of this in our report where some agencies use external advisory groups like the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, CASAC, or there's an external advisory group for the dietary guidelines that HHS and USDA gets help from, and there are probably others as well. And the idea of independent third party or external expert retrospective review is also, I think, indicated towards the end of our report, where we talk about, there's a point where we talk about another paper that Laurie Benier and I wrote for Art Frost and Dick Morgenstern's project at RFF on retrospective review a year ago, in which Laurie and I talked about the idea of having a commission or an outside expert body to conduct retrospective reviews of multiple rules, which other people have also written about that. So I'm favorable to this idea.
Laurie?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that we talk a little bit about it in the report, particularly those examples that you gave for advisory bodies, but this largely seems like it relates to our institutions paper. And we didn't get a lot of discussion from the interviewees of strong preferences or desire to have this done by a third party, nor that they felt somehow it would be better. I don't know. It feels like it's not tied to this report, but it's certainly an idea that we've talked to Art and Dick about at length. So I can see why they brought it up, but it feels a little out of place to me here, given the evidence that we present in this particular report.
So I'm going to, again, now speaking as a committee member, not as the chair, so I want to hear comments. My reaction to this is similar to what Laurie's was. It felt like a different idea, not necessarily a bad idea, but just a different idea than the focus of the report. It's also something I just don't know anything about. It might very well be worth considering. It might very well be putting in the hopper for the next project on periodic review, to say like other ways of doing it, or something like that. It doesn't really feel like it's related to periodic retrospective review. It's not about periodic at all. It's just a different way of doing retrospective review. That's me speaking as a committee member, not as the chair.
Yeah.
Yes.
And Aaron, Mr. Chair, if I may,
Yes.
it may already be invoked by 11C, which talks about committees of experts either within or outside the agency to review regulations. So maybe that's already covers it.
All right, Bill Funk, and then Jennifer.
Well, I like John's last comment, because I think the point is a good one that that they've raised in their comments, but I do agree with John that it's certainly within the character of C of establishing cooperating with standing committees of experts outside the agency. That's exactly what they're recommending. So I'd say it's covered.
Well, I think they're asking a little bit more than that. Maybe I'm misreading what they're saying. I thought that they were saying that it would be a third party that would do the retrospective review, not just working with outside experts to do it. But maybe that's what they meant. All they mean by that. I'm certainly okay with something more that, yeah, work with third parties, whatever. I thought we're talking about a new way to do this altogether.
Well, Aaron, I mean, their last sentence says such arrangements could involve collection and public distribution of key data and/or the support of independent retrospective studies administered by NSF or other scientific bodies. So I don't know, I still think it's covered by it.
Okay, Jennifer.
Yeah, I agree. I was going to also call out 11C before Jonathan did. My one suggestion might be to delete the words standing committees off, because I think that does narrow it to potentially like it's something like advisory committees, like Jonathan was saying. But I actually think that this could incorporate a lot of what Richard and Art are bringing up. And for what it's worth, I agree with the substance of their comment. I mean, I think that the retrospective analyses of cost benefit analysis that are out there, I think are mostly done by academics, like Michael Greenstone has done with the most prominent with the Clean Air Act. And, I also think that it's also incorporated with establishing or cooperating, because I don't think that the substance of the comment necessarily goes to ceding control of the entire review to this outside expert. I think that, outside expert could do the retrospective cost benefit analysis, which could then be fed into the agency's own periodic review of the entire regulation itself.
All right, thank you. Dave.
I'm actually looking back at a previous ACUS recommendation on retrospective review of agency rules, 2014-5. And this one says, agencies should consider assigning primary responsibility for conducting retrospective review to a set of officials other than those responsible for producing or enforcing the regulation. If adequate resources are available, reviewing officials should coordinate and collaborate with rule producers and enforcers. So I guess my point is, this seems to be going well beyond what that prior recommendation was, but we don't really have a lot to say that we've got more here with this report than what we had back in 2014 about how retrospective reviews should be conducted. So I don't know that we necessarily are ready to go beyond the assigned primary responsibility for conducting retrospective review to a set of officials other than those responsible.
Okay, Dave, while I've got you, what is your reaction to relying on 11C to kind of address all of these concerns, but at a high enough level of generality that we're not committing ourselves to any specific model of this?
How do you mean relying on it, though? Simply striking A, B, and D?
No, I think, well, I mean, we could do that too. I was going to say, essentially say to that argument, to that response, no, we're already including that idea in C, but we're not going to do it at any level of detail more than we've already said before. You could consider, if you want to bring in experts to do this, that's fine, but we are not taking any position what if you should or you shouldn't. It's just something you can consider.
Okay, I guess my point is that there seems to be a preference in a prior ACUS recommendation about how to structure it. And that being, agencies should consider assigning primary responsibility to a set of officials other than those. And that seems to sort of cut against 11A. So you're presenting A, B, C, and D as equally valid, but it seems like there is an earlier recommendation which does state a preference. And so laying A through D as all equally valid would seem to go against that prior recommendation.
Yeah, we're gonna go through all of them individually. So we might very well say that we're concerned about A. I'm now more just trying to say we have a comment from some pretty smart people who do this. I want to make sure that we're not disrespecting anybody and that we're listening to them and incorporating their idea. I've heard from Jennifer and Bill and Jonathan that we think that 11C already does that. Does that make sense for you? And if so, then we can talk about whether 11A makes sense. But
yeah, no, I see what you're saying. No, I think that the previous recommendation seems to point to B. Although as an outside observer, I would have a tough time saying C isn't a good idea. I think it's simply, if you're working within the constraints of the agency, then the previous recommendation points to B.
Okay, all right, and Joseph O'Connell.
I may be confused, but I don't read the earlier recommendation that way. I read the earlier recommendation to say that those who develop and enforce the rules should not, in many contexts, be the one to review retrospectively the rule. And I don't see A in conflict with that at all. Right? It's that you're going to, for these reviews, you're going to go back to the same people, but those people are not in A equated with those who develop and enforce the rule. And I'm a little worried about the concern kind of pushing agencies to rely on outsiders, and that's not how I read the earlier recommendation, and it's not how I read the current draft here.
All right, so let's do this in order. As I hear the group, I've not heard anybody disagree with the initial reaction from Jennifer, Bill, and Jonathan that we've already included the comments from Dick and Art in 11C. So if that's the case, I'm going to say let's move on and delete that comment. Bill says a comment, but real fast, then I'm just going to say, once we've done with that, then we're going to get to Ann's point and Dave's point about A, B, C, and D. But that I just want to make sure we get that comment done first. So Bill.
In C, strike the standing, don't strike committees of, because you can't establish experts. So leave committees of, but just strike the standing.
Jennifer, does that work for you? Hearing none, I'm going to go with that. If I don't hear any other reactions to this, we're going to delete the comment from Dick and Art, and we're going to say that that is right. Oh, Robert has a comment.
Sure. I think we could delete standing, but just replace establishing with something like engaging, because that could include anything from contracting to granting to appointing as an expert or consultant.
I like that. Bill?
Fine, it was just, you couldn't, no problem.
Okay, all right. Hearing no other responses, we're going to delete the comment where we've incorporated a fair. Okay, Jennifer. All right. Jennifer.
I apologize. I don't know if you brought this up, but can somebody just bring it? Why did we put back in committees? Because my concern there is, again, it calls out advisory committees. I'm worried about why not contracting with individual experts. What's the problem with that?
Bill?
Now that we've eliminated the word establish, you could eliminate committees as well. My point was only you couldn't establish experts.
Okay, great.
Okay, all right, great. We've got that. Okay, now we've got 8 minutes. I suspect that we will end with 11A, and maybe 11B too, because they kind of go together. We have a comment from Anne and from Dave about, how, if we're being consistent with the 14 recommendation. Dave reads the 14 recommendation to say that we should essentially B is the preferred. We've already said we prefer B. That's not how Anne reads the earlier recommendation. And I confess that I don't know. But so I'm going to throw it out to the committee. What do we think? I have trouble imagining that we thought that it should be a different team. I think that we must have thought that it shouldn't be the enforcers, but maybe I'm wrong about that. So maybe this is a question for Leanne or Reeve, just like a question about the 14 recommendation first. What is your sense? Again, realizing that the committee can override you on it.
Yeah, so legislative history-wise, I mean, as I recall, I don't think there was a lot of discussion surrounding it. I think it was put out there more really as an option than anything. That's one possible approach, and that seems to be in accord with what we're doing here. I don't think that there was extensive discussion surrounding it, though, as I recall, bearing in mind this was a while ago. But I don't see anything that you're doing here as being necessarily inconsistent with that, though I do take Dave's point that it seems to point more toward A as opposed to the other items in the list.
So here's a question for Dave. Is your concern, Dave, consistency with the 14 recommendation, or is it a substantive point that you think that 11A is the correct way, or I think you want 11B. 11B is the correct way of doing it, and that we shouldn't say 11A or 11C is just as good, because in fact, you have a substantive preference for 11B.
I have a substantive preference for B, C, and D.
Okay.
My preference is against A, leaving the leaving the retrospective review in the hands of the same officials that wrote the original rule. Obviously, that's an ideal, but that's I read the previous recommendation as wanting to encourage taking the review from the original authors, and I think that A seems to leave it with the original authors.
Anne, comment.
I think we could clarify A, so it would not be the enforcers, at least the enforcers of the rule. I think we could have a discussion as a committee about whether it should be those who helped draft the rule. I see a difference between the enforcers and the drafters. So there's kind of a substantive thing to resolve, but then you could just clarify kind of what A contains or doesn't contain. But I see putting the substantive kind of clarification to the side, that there are real efficiency advantages to having the same team review every 2, 3, 5 years a rule. Of course, you don't want it to be the enforcers of the rule, and maybe you don't want it to be the drafters of the rule, but it seems like kind of having the same group do it might make sense.
Robert.
Okay, hold on. Yeah, I think I'm unmuted now. I have a question about A and B. What is meant by staff? Do we mean the same team or same unit, or do we mean the same people? And does that change, which one we like better?
I'm going to throw this back to Lori and Jonathan. From your interviews, did the interviewees speak of staff in a particular sense?
It came up once. It came up in most detail with one of the agencies about having, I think it meant the same people working on it over time, so that there was that institutional learning. Actually, I think it came up in 2 of the interviews, now that I'm remembering another one. So that's, I guess, staff is like the agency staff. I don't.
Okay, so at least by the folks that you were talking to that kind of said this would be a good idea, it was the same people because they have institutional memory.
Correct, and that's not always possible, of course, because people leave and there's
correct
turn,
yeah.
but that it was viewed that there were a lot of efficiencies in having the same people working on these things each time.
Okay, so we've got 3 minutes left. We're not going to resolve this today. I have comments from Bill and comments from Dave. I will let you share those comments, and I think that's where we'll be done today, and we'll pick this up again in a couple of weeks. So Bill?
Well, it just seems to me you can't say to an agency, you shouldn't use the same staff. I mean, agencies will use the same staff on occasion, and all we're doing is providing options and putting in the second sentence in each option why that option might be a good idea. And you can do, as it says, you can do them in tandem or separately. You can even let both the same staff and outside staff do the same thing, have a red team and a blue team. So I just don't think the idea of eliminating any one of these is feasible.
And Dave, I will let you have the last word.
Certainly. I should say that my experience with periodic retrospective review comes from Clean Air Act rulemakings with EPA. So the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, statutory requirement for every 5 years, and the new source performance standards and NESHAPs, which are statutorily reviewed on the 8-year basis. And the way EPA does them is it is the same group on a constant basis doing the reviews, which naturally turn almost invariably into rulemakings. Because even if they don't have to do a substantive rule, they'll end up doing a rulemaking to justify not doing a substantive rulemaking. And I readily admit EPA is unique in the resources that it provides to retrospective review to a certain extent because of the long history of litigation surrounding their periodic reviews. There are obviously significant staff resource advantages to having that kind of repeated expertise when the timelines are so aggressive. I think that the question becomes, what happens with an agency that doesn't have such recurring, frequent reviews? There are multiple NACs that are constantly in a review phase. That team is all about retrospective review because that is essentially their job, is continuously updating. And on the stationary source side, NSPSs and NESHAPs, it's a constant churn. It seems to me that the value of this recommendation is for the agencies that do not have such a massive periodic retrospective review workload. And for those where the staff is not developed and hired, developed, and organized for retrospective review, there is value in saying you should have other people looking at your work because you don't have that constant churn. That said, I only point out again that prior ACUS recommendation saw value in separating the previous authors from the review, and I wouldn't want to see that diminished by listing A through D as all on equal footing.
All right, that is a great way to end this meeting. We will pick this up again in 2 weeks. Leanne, I think it would be helpful for the group if when you send around the materials for the next meeting, you also send around the 14 recommendation so we can just all give that a look and have that in front of us. Thanks, everybody. We're there. The end is in sight. Everybody's doing great. Pick it up again in 2 weeks. Thank you so much. Take care.